Welcome back to Dark Horror Narrations. I'm glad you're here tonight. What you're about to hear is a collection of 5 accounts from people who work the hours most people sleep through: security guards, highway crews, overnight dispatchers, night stalkers, wildland fire watchers, people who chose jobs that put them alone, or nearly alone, in the dark, in remote places, for hours at a stretch. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is a human-narrated first-person cryptid horror channel with stories from people who encountered something they couldn't explain. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you want. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in a city, apartment, a house in the suburbs, or somewhere considerably more isolated, drop it down below in the comments. Let's begin. The perimeter camera showed me walking the east fence at 2:47 a.m. I have the timestamp, I have the footage. The problem is I was sitting in the guard shack the entire time. I want to be clear about that before I get into the rest of it. I want you to understand that what I'm describing isn't a case of me falling asleep at the console, or misremembering where I was, or any of the other explanations my shift supervisor Ray offered when I played him the recording the next morning. The monitor was showing me or something wearing my shape moving along the east perimeter fence at 2:47 in the morning, while the interior camera in the guard shack was simultaneously showing me sitting in my chair, coffee cup in my right hand, watching the exact same screen that was showing my double outside. You can see my face in the interior footage. You can see my eyes tracking the monitors. I am watching myself walk a route I was not walking, and I did not understand what I was looking at until the thing outside stopped at the corner post, turned toward the camera, and stood completely still for 11 seconds. I counted those seconds later, going frame by frame on the exported file, before the company's security contractor told me the footage had been corrupted during a routine firmware update. I have a copy. I made 3 copies before I handed the original over. I'm telling you this because I want you to know this is documented. I want you to know I am not a person who makes things up. My name is Cal, and I worked private security contracts in rural Maricopa County for almost 8 years. Before that, I did 4 years with a logistics company running overnight inventory at warehouse facilities outside Phoenix. I am comfortable alone at night. I am comfortable with silence and heat, and the particular quality of darkness you only get when you are 20 miles from the nearest town, and the sky is doing things that sky in a city never does. I am not easily rattled. I say all of this so you understand the weight of what I'm telling you, because the night I'm describing rattled me in a way I have not fully recovered from, and I am not the kind of man who says that lightly. The Agua Fria solar array sits on roughly 4,000 acres of high desert scrubland northwest of Wickenburg, Arizona, about a mile east of the Agua Fria River corridor. If you've driven US 93 north out of Wickenburg toward Wickiup, you've probably seen it from the highway, row after row of photovoltaic panels angled south-southwest, stretching out across the Bajada like a vast dark mirror. The facility came online in 2016, and at peak capacity it can power something in the range of 60,000 homes. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you so you understand the scale. 4,000 acres is a lot of perimeter to cover on a 2-man night shift, which is part of why the company had invested in a camera network 42 fixed units mounted on 15-foot poles spaced along the interior and exterior fence lines, all feeding into 2 monitor arrays in the guard shack at the main gate. I had been running the night contract at Agua Fria for about 14 months when this happened. My partner on the graveyard shift was a man named Terrence, who worked the south gate position and primarily handled vehicle access logging and patrol of the lower array sections. We communicated by radio and occasionally by the phone line that ran between the 2 guard positions. Terrence had been doing security work longer than I had, and he was the kind of man who took pride in doing the job exactly right. Logs maintained to the minute, patrol routes walked on schedule, paperwork clean. We got along well because we had the same approach to the work. You do it properly or you don't do it at all. The shift started at 10 p.m. and ran until 6 a.m. Standard handoff from the swing crew, no anomalies noted in the log, weather clear. It was the second week of November, which in that part of Arizona means temperatures dropping into the mid-40s after midnight, dry air carrying the smell of creosote and cooling sand, the kind of sky overhead that makes you feel like you're at the bottom of something enormous. I remember noting in the log that there was no moon that night, new moon, or close enough to it that the ambient light across the array was almost nothing beyond the amber security floods mounted on the main gate posts and the green standby indicators running the length of the maintenance road. I did my first full exterior patrol at 11:30 p.m., which was standard. Walk the north fence, east fence, south fence, check gate hardware, check lock integrity on the maintenance bays, return through the interior road to the guard shack. 45 minutes, more or less, depending on pace. The ground out here is caliche and loose gravel over hardpan. It compacts in summer but loosens in the cooler months, and it holds a print well. I mention that because it matters later. I completed the patrol, logged it at 12:17 a.m., made a note that the east fence had a ground gap at marker post 14 that I'd been flagging for the facilities manager for 3 weeks, the kind of gap that wouldn't let a person through but would let a coyote or javelina pass under the chain link without effort. Nothing out of the ordinary. The east fence is the section that faces toward the Agua Fria River corridor, which runs roughly parallel to the property line about a mile out. The terrain between the fence and the river drops through scrub flats and dry wash channels, dense stands of creosote and desert willow, the kind of ground where you can move if you know it well and disappear completely if you want to. I had walked that section enough times to know its rhythms, which camera angles had dead spots, where the gravel was loose and where it had packed firm, which posts had shifted slightly from the ground frost the previous winter. You learn a perimeter after 14 months. It becomes something close to a map inside your own body. I poured coffee at 12:30 and settled in at the monitor console. This was the quiet part of the shift. Wickenburg sits on the edge of what was historically Yavapai land, and the desert out here has a quality at night that I always found difficult to describe. It is not exactly silent, because the wind moves through the creosote constantly, and there are sounds from the array itself, the low electrical hum from the inverter stations, the occasional tick of metal contracting in the cooling air. But it has a texture to its silence that feels different from urban quiet, heavier maybe, older. My first months on the contract, I used to keep the radio tuned to a country station out of Prescott during the slow hours between midnight and 4. By the time this happened, I had stopped doing that. The station's signal degraded badly past midnight, and I had gotten used to the silence in a way that I now think was a kind of mistake. Silence out there is not neutral. It communicates. When it changes quality in a way you can't immediately explain, that changes information, and you should treat it as such. Everything was routine until approximately 2:15 a.m., when I noticed that the motion alert indicator on camera 17 had tripped. Camera 17 covered the east fence line between marker posts 12 and 16, which is to say, the section directly adjacent to the ground gap I had flagged at post 14. A motion alert out there at this hour was not unusual. Javelina, jackrabbits, the occasional kit fox working the fence line. I pulled up the live feed on monitor 2 and watched the eastern section for about 90 seconds. Nothing visible. The camera's night vision showed the fence posts, the desert floor, the flat dark expanse of the scrub running east toward the Agua Fria corridor. Whatever had triggered the sensor had moved on. I logged it. 2:17 a.m. Motion alert camera. 17 no visual confirmation, probable wildlife, and returned to the main console view. At 2:31, camera 17 tripped again. This time I kept it on the main screen. Again, nothing. The fence was clear. The ground beneath it was undisturbed as far as the camera resolution could show me. I zoomed in on the post 14 section and looked at the gap. If anything had come through, the loose gravel on the interior side would have shown disturbance. It looked clean. I made a note and cycled to the other exterior cameras. All clear across the north and south lines. The array interior cameras showed the maintenance road empty, the inverter stations dark, the rows of panels running away into blackness. Terrence checked in on the radio at 2:35, his standard half-hour contact, and reported nothing unusual at the south gate. I told him about the camera 17 alerts. He said it was probably a fox working the gap. I agreed. What I did not say to Terrence, because I would have felt foolish saying it, was that the silence outside had changed sometime in the last 20 minutes. Not the audio pickup on the cameras, which was low quality and only captured sound within about 15 feet of each unit. I mean the silence I was aware of through the shack's walls. The particular ambient texture of the desert at that hour had gone flat. The wind through the creosote, which had been a near constant low-frequency presence since the start of the shift, had stopped. In November in that country, the wind doesn't just stop. It might slow, it might shift direction, but it does not stop. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that's been in a room for hours suddenly disappearing. The absence of it was louder than the thing itself had been. I got up at 2:42 to refill my coffee. The shack had a small counter along the south wall with a drip machine I kept running throughout the shift. I had my back to the monitors for perhaps 45 seconds. The pour, quick stir, I remember picking a small piece of grounds off my thumbnail. When I turned back around, camera 7 was showing a figure walking the east fence line. My first thought was that I had somehow missed Terrence, deciding to run an interior patrol without radioing ahead. My second thought, arriving almost simultaneously, was that the figure was too tall. Terrence is 5'9", stocky, always wearing his high-visibility safety vest over his jacket. The figure on camera 7 was tall and lean, wearing what appeared to be a security jacket similar to mine, and it was walking the east fence from north to south, at a pace that looked precisely like my own patrol pace, measured, professional, heel to toe, on the gravel. I watched it for probably 10 seconds before I looked at the interior camera, the one mounted above the door in my own guard shack on monitor 3. The interior camera showed me standing at the counter, coffee in my right hand, staring at the monitors. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Camera 7, exterior east fence, a figure in my jacket walking my patrol route. Monitor 3, interior guard shack, me, standing at the counter, watching camera 7, watching the figure walk my patrol route. Both feeds live. Both timestamped 2:47 a.m. I did not move for what the footage later confirmed was 6 seconds. Then I picked up the radio. "Terrence, you at your post?" "Where else would I be?" he said. That was Terrence, economical with words. "I need you to look at camera 7 on your secondary monitor." A pause. Terrence had a smaller display at the south gate that mirrored 4 of the exterior feeds on rotation. "That your feed? East fence?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Cal." "Who is that?" "I don't know." "That's your jacket." "I know." "You're in the shack." "I know." Terrence. I watched the figure on the screen. It was still walking south along the east fence, moving between the camera's fixed frame with that same measured gait. It passed post 14 the gap without pausing, without looking down, without any indication that it registered the opening in the fence that a person doing a legitimate patrol would check by habit. That struck me as wrong, in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Any security officer walking that section checks the gap. You do it automatically. You flagged it in the log enough times that your eyes go to it without thinking. The figure did not look down. It kept its eyes, if it had eyes, if the camera resolution could even tell me that, oriented forward toward the next post, and it walked with a steadiness that I remember now as the opposite of human. Not mechanical, not robotic, smooth, like something that had studied the movement and replicated it perfectly, but had no actual need to balance or compensate for uneven ground the way a person does. My own stride, when I watch myself on camera, has the slight micro-adjustments you don't notice in the moment, a half-inch shift left to avoid a rock, a barely perceptible slowing on loose gravel. The figure on camera 7 had none of that. It moved like my stride was a program it was running, and it had set the parameters to perfect. Terrence, I'm going to drive the east section. No, you're not, he said. Call the duty supervisor. He was right. Protocol was to call Ray, our shift supervisor, who worked a roving supervisory route covering 3 contracts that night. I called Ray on the secondary line. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Groggy, he had been parked somewhere between Wickenburg and Congress, probably asleep. I told him I had an unidentified individual on the east perimeter walking the fence line in what appeared to be a company-issued jacket. I told him the individual had not entered through any monitored access point. I told him I was certain I had not left my post. Ray said he'd be there in 20 minutes and told me to document and observe and not to engage unless the individual attempted to access the array interior. I went back to the monitor. The figure had stopped. It was standing at the southeast corner, post 16, the last post before the fence turned west along the south line, and it was facing the camera, not the fence, not the desert behind it, the camera. From 40 feet away, in the green-gray wash of night vision, I could see that it was standing completely still, and its face, if I can call it a face, was tilted slightly upward, oriented directly at the lens of camera 7. The night vision on these cameras is thermal assisted, which means it's picking up heat signatures as well as ambient light. The scrub behind the figure showed the faint bloom of retained heat from the day Kalish holds warmth into the night, and the camera shows it as a soft gray glow along the ground. The figure itself showed no thermal bloom. Its outline was as cold as the metal fence posts on either side of it. I have the exported frame. I can show you the thermal layer. In a 40-degree night, in a jacket, a human being should look like a torch relative to the background. This figure looked like part of the fence. It stood there for 11 seconds. I counted them later. Then it turned, walked south along the interior of the fence toward the south line, and passed out of camera 7's field of view. I immediately pulled up camera 22, which covered the south fence, from east to west. Nothing. Camera 18, south gate approach. Nothing. Camera 11, southeast array interior. Nothing. Whatever it was, it had moved in the approximately 4 seconds between camera 7 losing it and me pulling the south feeds. And it had moved somewhere the cameras weren't pointed. I did not find it again on any feed. Ray arrived at 3:14 a.m. I met him at the main gate and walked him through the footage in real time. He watched it twice without saying anything. Then he watched the thermal layer comparison I had flagged. He was quiet for a long time after that, the kind of quiet that tells you a person is recalibrating, adjusting something they thought they understood about how the world works. You didn't go out there, he said. It wasn't a question. I was at the console the whole time. Terrence confirmed that. He was on the radio with me when it was on screen. He saw it on his secondary monitor. Ray rubbed his face. He was a former Maricopa County deputy, 15 years on before he moved to private sector, and he had the manner of a man who had learned to hold his reactions in reserve until he had enough information to justify them. I respected that about him. Okay, he said. We do a full exterior walk, both of us. Document the fence line. You stay on my left. I want your eyes on the ground. Before we went out, Ray did something I noticed but didn't comment on at the time. He went to his vehicle and retrieved what I initially thought was a large flashlight, one of the commercial-grade construction site work lights that run off a rechargeable battery pack, the kind that throws about 5,000 lumens in a wide flood pattern. He carried it to the main gate post and aimed it east, flooding the interior road and the first 50 yards of the array approach with harsh white light. The shadows it cast were flat and hard, and it turned the gravel a chalky near white and made the fence posts look like bones. I asked him if he usually carried that on supervisory rounds. He said he'd started keeping it in the truck about 2 years prior, after an incident at another contract out near Aguila. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. We walked the east fence, starting from the north corner. The caliche and gravel out there was still holding the coolness of the night, the air carrying the faint mineral smell of dust and the distant green bite of the creosote stands that began maybe 100 yards east of the fence line. I had my flashlight in a wide sweep. Ray had his, and we moved south along the fence, checking for disturbance, for footprints, for any indication of where the figure had gone or come from. The first notable thing was the absence of animal sign. I mentioned earlier that the east fence line regularly showed evidence of the local wildlife kit fox tracks in the soft ground near the posts, javelina rubs on the chain link where the mesh met a corner brace, occasional rabbit droppings in the gravel where the animals worked the gap. Tonight there was nothing. The ground between posts 10 and 16, the full camera 17 coverage zone, was clean in a way that felt deliberate, not in the way you describe if you were being precise and scientific about it. Clean in the way that a room feels when something large has recently been in it and the smaller things have left. At post 14, the gap, we stopped. The gravel on the exterior side of the fence was disturbed, not dramatically, not in the way you'd expect if something large had pushed through the gap or dragged itself under the chain link. But there were impressions in the loose material that didn't match any animal track I knew. They were long, narrow. They suggested something that had moved on 2 feet, with a stride length I estimated at about 4 feet, which, for reference, is longer than my own stride by a significant margin, and I am 6 feet tall. The impressions were deep at the heel and nearly absent at the toe, which is the inverse of how a person actually walks. You load the forefoot when you accelerate. You load the heel when you decelerate or when you're being careful. Whatever had made these tracks was doing neither. It was loading the heel consistently, uniformly, across every step, like something that had approximated bipedal locomotion from the outside, and gotten most of it right, but not all of it. Ray crouched over the tracks with his flashlight for a long time. He didn't say anything. He took out his phone and photographed them from 3 angles without being asked. When he stood back up, he swept his light east across the scrub, out toward the river corridor, and held it there. The creosote stood still in the light, casting long shadows back toward us, and beyond the first row of brush, the darkness resumed completely. There was nothing visible out there. There was nothing that should have been visible, but I had a clear, specific physical sensation standing at that fence line that I have only experienced a handful of times in my life, the sensation of something large and entirely aware, giving you its complete attention from a distance. Not watching, not curious, just present in the way that a calculation is present, waiting to resolve. Ray lowered his light first. "Okay," he said again quietly, "back to the shack." We walked the return route at the same steady pace he'd set on the way out. I noticed that he kept the work light in his left hand, pointed at the ground ahead of us, rather than back toward the fence. He was not looking back. I took my cue from him, and did not look back either. Some part of me, the part that had been doing this work for 8 years, and had learned a few things about what constitutes a reasonable response to uncertainty, understood that turning around to look at the darkness we'd just walked away from was not something either of us was going to do. The tracks came from the east, from the direction of the river corridor, and they stopped at the gap. On the interior side of the fence there was no corresponding disturbance. Nothing had come through. It had come to the gap, stopped, and then, as far as we could tell from the physical evidence, it had simply not been there anymore. Ray photographed the tracks with his phone. He called them into the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line and filed an initial verbal report. The deputy who took the call told him a unit would be out in the morning to document the scene. I went back to the guard shack and wrote up my incident log in full, time-stamped and detailed, and emailed it to the company's operations coordinator before my shift ended at 6 a.m. I did not go back out to the east fence that night. The morning crew came on at 6, and I gave them the full verbal brief. The day shift supervisor, a man named Art, listened without interrupting and then asked me if I was sure I hadn't just been watching a recording on loop. I told him the timestamps were live. He shrugged in the way people shrug when they've decided the explanation they can accept is more comfortable than the one being offered. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 8:15 and walked the post 14 area. He photographed the track impressions, took measurements, and wrote up an incident report. I have the report number, Incident MCSO 234771. He attributed the tracks to unknown large animal, possibly elk, moving down from the Bradshaw Mountains, territorial behavior near fence line. He was professional and thorough, and I could see in the way he wrote his notes that he was doing the same recalibration Ray had done, choosing the explanation that fit inside what he already knew to be possible. The camera footage was flagged for review by the company's security technology contractor. 4 days later, I received an email stating that the footage from camera 7 and the interior guard shack camera between 2:30 and 3 a.m. on that date had been corrupted during a routine firmware synchronization update and could not be recovered. The email thanked me for my documentation and reminded me that the camera system was under a software maintenance cycle. I had made 3 copies of the exported files before I turned the originals over. I made those copies the morning after the incident, before I handed anything to anyone. I still have them. Terrence put in for a shift reassignment the following week. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. He moved to a contract covering a business park in Surprise, Arizona, and as far as I know, he's still doing that work. We talked once more after his reassignment, briefly, and the only thing he said about the night at Agua Fria was this. The thing that bothered me, Cal, was it wasn't looking at the camera because it saw the camera. It was looking at the camera because it knew you were watching. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. I resigned the Agua Fria contract 6 weeks after the incident, not out of fear, or at least not entirely, but because I could not shake the feeling that whatever had walked that fence line had not been testing the perimeter. It had not been scouting for a way in. It had been demonstrating something. It had been showing me a thing I was not meant to see, and it had stood in front of camera 7 for exactly long enough to make certain I saw it clearly, and then it had gone back to wherever it came from, unhurried. Its cold outline moving through the scrub toward the river corridor in the dark. The gap at post 14 was repaired, finally, 3 months after I flagged it. The ground gap report is still in the facilities management log as a maintenance ticket, opened by me in late October and closed in early February. Routine. Unremarkable. The kind of record that makes everything look like it makes sense if you don't know what else was filed in the same period. There are things I know now that I didn't know then. I know that the Agua Fria River corridor between Wickenburg and the Congress area has a long history of reports, not the kind that make newspapers, but the kind that circulate among people who work the land out there. Ranchers, water board surveyors, border patrol units working the northern corridors. I know that the particular quality of that ground, the way the Kelichi holds impressions, and the way the river corridor cuts through the desert, creates a kind of path, a natural movement route that something has been using for far longer than the solar array has been there. I know that what I saw on camera 7 had no thermal signature in 40-degree weather, that it moved with no friction against the ground, that it knew exactly where the camera was and exactly how long to stand in front of it. I know that the track impressions at post 14 came from outside the fence, moved to the gap, and then stopped, not continued through, not reversed, stopped. And I know that whatever left those tracks and whatever appeared on camera 7 was the same thing, and that it had been there before I ever started that shift, and that it will be there long after the solar array is eventually decommissioned and the desert reclaims those 4,000 acres. I am not telling you this to frighten you, though I understand if you are. I am telling you this because I spent 8 years working alone at night in the desert, and I was good at the work, and I trusted my instruments, and I trusted my documentation. And one night in November, all of those things together showed me something that has no business existing in the same world as incident reports and firmware updates, and a deputy writing unknown large animal in a field he left blank on the first pass and came back to fill with something that fit. If you work alone at night, especially in open country, especially near river corridors or natural terrain breaks, where the land has been moving things around for longer than anyone can map, Trust your thermal. Trust your secondary cameras. And if something appears on your footage that cannot account for itself by any measure you have available, if it shows up in 2 feeds simultaneously, if it has no heat, if it stands in front of the lens without curiosity and without threat and without anything you can identify as a reason, log it, copy it, and do not go out to find it. It already knows where you are. The last thing you want is to give it proof that the feeling is mutual. The flagger on the south end of our lane closure had been standing at his post for 40 minutes before we realized we hadn't assigned anyone to that position. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision is what kept me credible when I had to explain this to my foreman, to the ADOT incident coordinator, and eventually to the Mohave County Sheriff's deputy, who drove out at 4 in the morning to look at a stretch of State Route 93 and write down things in a notebook that I suspect he went home and drank to forget. The lane closure went active at 10:45 p.m. The South Flagger position a quarter mile down the highway from the active work zone, where a person with a sign and a vest keeps northbound traffic from drifting into the taper, was supposed to be staffed by a man named Eddie Ruiz, who had called in sick that afternoon with a stomach thing that had been going around the crew. Our foreman, a man named Garrett, had made the decision to run the closure with one flagger on the north end only, since the southbound traffic at that hour on that stretch of 93 was light enough to manage with the automated aero board we had positioned at the merge point. The south end was empty. Garrett had signed off on it. I had confirmed it in the traffic control log at 10:40 p.m., 15 minutes before we opened the closure. At 11:25 p.m., I looked south down the highway, and there was a flagger standing at the quarter-mile mark. I am a traffic control technician with the Arizona Department of Transportation. I have been doing this work for 6 years on the night crew out of the Kingman District Office, and before that I did 2 years of highway construction work in Nevada. I know what a staffed flagger position looks like from a quarter mile away at night. I know the silhouette of a person in a safety vest holding a sign paddle. I know how they stand. I know the way a human being distributes their weight when they've been on their feet for an hour in the November cold. I know all of those things well enough that when I looked south at 11:25 and saw that position staffed, my first honest reaction was not alarm. It was confusion, followed immediately by the practical thought that Garrett must have called in a replacement for Eddie without telling me, which would have been unlike him but not impossible. I keyed my radio. Garrett, did you get a replacement for Eddie on the south end? A pause. Static. Then, no. Why? I looked south again. The figure was still there. Because someone's standing at the south position. The radio was quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted them, and then Garrett said, "Don't move. I'm coming to you." While I waited for Garrett, I kept my eyes on the figure, and I ran through the logical explanations, the way you do when something doesn't match your expectations and you want it to match before you have to report it. A motorist who had pulled off and was standing on the shoulder possible, except there were no vehicles visible. One of the crew had walked south for a reason I hadn't tracked, except I had visual on the equipment staging area, and everyone was where they were supposed to be. A trick of the light and the arrow board strobing and the flat geometry of the highway producing an apparition at the quarter-mile mark possible, except when I raised my hand to block the arrow board's strobe from my eyeline, the figure was still there. A person, standing at a flagger position, in the correct equipment, at a quarter mile of distance in the dark. My brain kept trying to land on that explanation and kept sliding off of it because the stillness was wrong. I have stood a lot of flagger shifts. I have watched a lot of flaggers stand their shifts. Nobody stands like that. Nobody can. The stretch of State Route 93 where this happened runs through a section of Mohave County that most people only see at highway speed on their way from Wickenburg to Kingman. It is high desert, flat to gently rolling, with the Joshua tree stands beginning around the Wickiup area and the terrain opening out into wide Bahada flats that, in the dark, feel enormous in a way that photographs never quite capture. The highway here runs almost perfectly straight for about 12 miles, which means at night, with your work zone lighting and your aero board and your equipment flashers, you are a small lit island in a very large darkness. I had worked this section of road maybe 30 times over the years. I knew its particular quality of isolation, the way the wind off the high desert plain hits you differently than in town, the way the sound of the occasional semi coming up from the south carries for what feels like miles before the truck itself appears in your lights. Out past the shoulder, the Joshua trees stood in the dark like people frozen mid-gesture, and beyond them the desert floor ran flat in every direction until it met the mountains, which at night were just an absence of stars along the horizon. The work that night was a mill and fill on a deteriorated section of the southbound travel lane, about 800 feet of pavement that had cracked, rutted from the summer heat cycles, and needed the surface pulled and relaid before the next freeze-thaw season did worse damage to the base. It was the kind of job we did dozens of times a year. Set the closure, bring in the milling machine to cut the old surface down 2 inches, follow it with the paving crew laying the new mix, roll it, open the road back up before morning traffic. Routine. The kind of work where your hands know what to do and your brain can run on a lower setting. The kind of night where you are mostly managing logistics and paperwork and watching the equipment operator keep his lines clean, and where the biggest variable is usually the weather or an inconsiderate driver blowing through the taper without slowing down. The crew that night was 7 people, including Garrett and me. The paving crew brothers named Pete and Lou, and a third man named Stefan ran the hand tools behind the machine. Darnell operated the roller. 2 flaggers, a man named Victor on the north position, a half-mile up from the work zone, keeping southbound traffic managed through the single-lane alternating setup, and the south position, which should have been Eddie, which was empty. We were running a closed lane rather than alternating traffic. The closure allowed us to shut the lane completely and work without flagger coordination for the actual paving phase. Victor's job at the north end was to hold traffic while the roller made its passes and released them through during gaps. The south end, under normal circumstances, provides a warning presence for any northbound traffic that might come up on the taper before the aero board gives them enough reaction time. With light overnight traffic, Garrett had made the judgment call that the aero board alone was sufficient. That call was documented within ADOT protocol for low volume conditions, and every one of us on that crew had confirmed before we opened the closure at 10:45 p.m. that the south position was empty. At 11:25 that night, the air temperature was 41 degrees and dropping. There was a light northwest wind, not strong, but steady, the kind that gets into your collar regardless of how you have your jacket zipped. The sky was clear, and the stars over the Hualapai Mountains to the west were the hard, brilliant kind you only see at elevation in dry air. I had been on shift since 10 p.m., and I was alert, caffeinated, doing my job correctly. I am telling you this so there is no ambiguity about my state of mind. Garrett reached me in about 2 minutes. Coming up from the equipment staging area in the north shoulder where we had the milling machine and the paving truck idled. He was a compact man, maybe 5'8", built like someone who had done physical work his whole life, with 22 years of ADOT experience behind him, and a temperament so flat and practical that I had literally never heard him raise his voice. He stopped next to me and looked south. "I see it," he said. "I logged the south position as empty at 10:40. I know. I signed the traffic control plan." We stood there together for a moment. The figure at the quarter-mile mark was standing exactly where a flagger would stand, right at the end of the taper, on the right shoulder, facing north to receive our lane's traffic before directing it to merge. It was wearing what appeared to be a high-visibility safety vest, the kind we all wore, lime green with silver reflective striping. It was holding a sign paddle, or something shaped like one. The position was correct. The equipment was correct. The stance was wrong. A person standing a flagger shift will move. Not constantly, not dramatically, but they shift their weight, they roll their shoulders against the cold, they check their phone, they turn to look south for incoming headlights. This is not a conscious behavior. It is what a human body does when it is upright and cold and has been standing in one place for a while. The figure at the south end was not moving. It was not shifting. It was not checking anything. It was standing the way a post stands, with a fixity that I registered before I was able to articulate why it bothered me. Perfectly still. Perfectly placed. Wrong. I'm going to radio the crew, Garrett said. He did a head count over the radio, 3 paving crew on the machine, 2 on the handwork detail behind it, 1 equipment operator in the roller. All accounted for, all within 50 yards of the equipment staging area. Nobody had walked south. Nobody had left the work zone. Garrett looked at me. I looked at Garrett. He said, "All right, I'm going to drive down to it." He said "it" without catching himself, which I noticed. "I'll come with you," I said. We took his ADOT pickup, which was parked in the north shoulder with its amber flasher bar running. He pulled a U-turn and drove south along the closed lane, keeping about 30 miles per hour, his headlights cutting down the straight, empty highway. The reflective striping on the figure's vest picked up our lights almost immediately. It lit up the way proper reflective gear should, bright silver white, and for a moment that almost made it okay. Reflective gear, working correctly, looked normal. The rest of it was not. As we got closer, I could see the proportions more clearly, and the proportions were wrong. I had been looking at it from a quarter mile away before, and the distance had smoothed things out. Up close from about 150 yards, I could see that the figure was too tall. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make you point at it on the street in daylight and call it abnormal, but in the specific way that matters when you're looking at something that is supposed to be one of your crew members in a position you walk past all night. The vest was the right vest, same design, same reflective pattern, but the person inside it was elongated in a way that made the vest look like it had been scaled up slightly, like a proportional adjustment had been applied to a template. The arms were long, not grotesquely so, just long enough that the sign paddle, which should have rested roughly at hip height on an average-sized person, was instead hanging around mid-thigh. The sign paddle. At 200 feet, I registered what the sign paddle said. Our stop, slow paddles have a specific configuration. Stop on one face in red, slow on the other in orange. Retroreflective material on both. Standard MUTCD specification. The figure was displaying its paddle facing north, which was correct procedure for a south end flagger receiving northbound traffic, but the face it was showing was blank. Not worn or faded. I want to be specific about this, because worn paddles have a characteristic look. The lettering ghosted, but still present. The retroreflective surface dulled from UV. This face had full retroreflective brightness. It lit up in our headlights, exactly as a compliant paddle should. The octagonal shape was correct. The substrate appeared new. There were simply no letters. The surface was uninterrupted. The space where the word would have been was just more of the same reflective material, as uniform, as if it had never been anything else. I do not know what it means that it had the right sign and the wrong text. I have a theory, but I am not sure. I want to say it out loud. Garrett stopped the truck at about 100 yards and left the headlights on. The figure turned to look at us. It turned slowly, the way you'd turn if you'd been stationary for a long time and needed to reorient. It came around to face the truck directly, and in the headlights I could see the vest, the hard hat which I hadn't been able to make out from distance, and below the hard hat brim, a face that I am going to do my best to describe accurately, because I have tried to describe it accurately every time I've been asked, and I have not yet fully succeeded. The face was in the right place. The geometry, eyes, nose, mouth, the general arrangement of features was correct at distance, but the skin was wrong. Not in a way I can attribute to lighting, because we had 2 headlights on it from 100 yards, and the reflective vest was throwing some of that light back upward. The skin was the color of the desert floor, a dry, pale gray tan, the specific tone of caliche in the cold. the color of something that had been out in the sun and wind for a very long time and had had whatever living quality it once held cooked completely out of it. And the eyes caught the headlights and reflected in a way that human eyes do not the small, focused, pinpoint reflection of a person caught in bright light. The full surface of both eyes returning the light as a single flat plane, amber, wide, like the eye of a deer caught in a vehicle's beam, except the face it was sitting in was not a deer's face and had not, until recently, been trying to be. Garrett had both hands on the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. I had not seen Garrett's knuckles be white in 6 years. The figure opened its mouth. I did not hear sound from it. The truck windows were up, and we were 100 yards out, and the engine was running. But I could see the jaw drop to a position that was not quite the range of motion a human jaw operates in, slightly too far, and something about that angle, about the specific geometry of the opening, turned my stomach in a way that I cannot explain by any mechanical process. It wasn't the wrongness on its own. It was the recognition, the part of my brain that operates below language, the part that has been doing threat assessment since before we were people, that was saying, very quietly and very clearly, that is not a face. That is a rendering of a face. And whatever is wearing it has just decided you are close enough. Garrett, I said. Yeah, he said. We should go. He put the truck in reverse. He did not take his eyes off it. He backed the truck up at about 15 miles per hour for roughly 300 yards before he turned it around, and then he drove north at a speed I would estimate as somewhat above the posted limit, which, under the circumstances, seemed entirely reasonable. Back at the staging area, Garrett got everyone onto the equipment and moved the entire work zone, set up trucks, roller, all of it north by a quarter mile, compressing the closure and keeping everything inside the arc of the aeroboard's light and the portable work zone floods we had mounted on the equipment. He did it without explaining himself to the crew, and the crew did it without asking questions, because Garrett's tone of voice when he told them to move was the kind of tone that does not invite questions. Pete and Lou and Stefan relocated their hand tools without comment. Darnell repositioned the roller in under 3 minutes. Victor, at the North Flagger position, came in on the radio asking what the change was about, and Garrett told him we were adjusting the closure length for equipment reasons, which was not true, but which was the kind of thing Victor could accept and move on from. I set up the relocated floodlights on the equipment frames myself, making sure the coverage was tight and consistent, no gaps, no shadow pockets, the work zone perimeter as well lit as we could make it with what we had on site. I am not a person who prays regularly. But I remember thinking, while I was positioning those lights, that there was something almost ritual about it, like building a fire to keep the dark back, like the light was the point, not the visibility it provided for the work. The milling machine sat idle for about 20 minutes while the repositioning happened. Garrett stood at the south edge of the new staging area the entire time with his flashlight in his hand and his eyes on the darkness beyond where our floods ended. He did not say anything. He did not check his phone or his clipboard. He just watched. At approximately 12:40 a.m., the figure appeared again. It was at the edge of the work zone lighting now, not inside it, not outside it, but at the precise margin where the LED flood from the paving truck's light bar ended and the highway darkness resumed. It was standing at that line exactly, perfectly, as if the boundary of the light were a physical wall it was pressing against from the outside. I have thought about that positioning many times since. It wasn't standing back from the light the way an animal will stand back from a fire, giving itself distance as a safety margin. It was standing at the line with a precision that felt deliberate, measured, like something that had determined exactly where the light ended and had placed itself there with the same care I had placed those flood fixtures, because it understood the boundary the same way I did and had chosen to occupy it, rather than retreat from it. It was still wearing the vest and the hard hat. It was still holding the blank sign paddle. Its face, at 50 yards, was turned toward the crew, and in my peripheral vision I could see Pete stop working and look at it, and then look at Garrett, and then put his head down and keep raking the mix. That small act, Pete choosing the job over the fear because the job was something he could control, is one of the details from that night that has stayed with me clearest. We were all doing that in our different ways, holding on to the procedure, the documented closure, the correct equipment positions, the mix temperatures, and the roller pass counts, the things that had rules. Because everything with rules was safe, and everything without them was standing 50 yards away at the edge of our lights with a face that should not have been a face. Garrett got on his radio and called in a 1046 obstruction in work zone to the ADOT District Operations Center and requested a Mojave County Sheriff's Unit for assistance with an unresponsive individual at his traffic control perimeter. The dispatcher asked if anyone was injured. Garrett said no. She said a unit was about 40 minutes out. Garrett stood watching it, with both arms at his sides. Then he keyed his radio. Victor, what's your status? Victor came back immediately. North end, all clear. One vehicle held, waiting on release. Garrett looked at me. He held the radio up and pressed the talk key again. Before he could speak, the radio produced a sound that was not static and was not feedback. It was a voice coming through on our closed work zone channel, the frequency we used for crew communication only, and the voice was Garrett's. It said his own name back to him with a cadence that was almost right, almost the way Garrett would say his name if he were answering a question, except the timing was a half beat off, and the inflection at the end rose slightly in a way that Garrett's voice never rose. Garrett's voice did nothing uncertain. This did. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. Then Garrett said, in a voice so flat it was almost frightening, "You heard that?" "Yes," I said. "That was our channel." "Yes." He keyed the radio once more and said, very clearly, "We're done for tonight." Then he called the District Operations Center on the secondary line. I tracked the figure at the light line for 11 minutes on my watch, because tracking is what I do when calm and practical requires active maintenance. At 12:51 a.m., a northbound semi came through the taper, and as its headlights swept the south shoulder where the figure had been standing, it was gone. Not at the moment the lights arrived. Slightly before, as if it had detected the approaching headlights from a distance and withdrawn with enough lead time to be absent before illumination reached the spot where it had stood. The semi passed through without slowing. Its driver saw an empty shoulder. He was luckier than he knew. The deputy, a man named Walsh from the Kingman substation, arrived at 1:30 a.m. He drove down from the north in a marked unit with his light bar running, which created an interesting effect. The highway for a quarter mile in each direction suddenly looked like daytime, the Joshua trees casting hard shadows off into the desert, every rock and lane marker and painted edge line standing out in harsh relief. I remember thinking that the light felt good, more than the practical benefit of it. It felt like something had been said. Walsh was professional and careful in the way that good rural deputies tend to be less interested in procedure for its own sake, and more interested in understanding what had actually happened. He took my statement first, then Garrett's, then brief accounts from Pete and Lou, who had seen the figure at the light line. He wrote everything down in longhand, in a small notebook, his handwriting precise and unhurried, and he did not interrupt any of us while we were talking, or suggest alternative explanations until he had the complete picture. Then he walked the south shoulder with his flashlight for about 20 minutes, working methodically from the point where our floodlights ended out toward the section of road where the figure had originally appeared. I watched him from the staging area. He moved in slow passes, the lights sweeping left and right at ground level, and occasionally he stopped and crouched and looked at something more closely. He came back to us after those 20 minutes and said he had found disturbance in the gravel shoulder, not clear prints, but disruption of the loose material in the shoulder aggregate that was inconsistent with normal vehicle wash. He photographed it. He also noted that the fence posts marking the highway boundary had rust disturbed from their midsections, as if something had steadied itself against them, and the rust flake pattern on the ground below was fresh. He noted all of this in his report and did not offer an explanation for it. He wrote up the incident as Mohave County Sheriff's Office Report Number MCS 23894, listing the event as an unknown individual who had fled prior to law enforcement arrival. He told us to contact ADOT security if the individual reappeared, and to not approach under any circumstances. He said this last part, do not approach, in a tone that was slightly more weighted than the rest of what he said, slightly more careful. I did not ask him if he had ever taken a call like this before. The ADOT incident coordinator reviewed our traffic control log the following week and noted that the South Flagger position had been correctly documented as unstaffed for the duration of the closure. He found no administrative violation. The crew's statements were filed as supporting documentation. The file was closed as a non-injury incident with no corrective action required. The radio transmission, the one where our closed channel broadcast Garrett's own voice back at him, was noted in the log as possible signal bleed from adjacent frequency. No technical fault identified. The district radio technician ran a diagnostic on our equipment 2 days later and found nothing wrong with it. Eddie Ruiz came back to work the following Monday. He looked fine. He did not know anything had happened. I did not tell him, because I did not know how to tell him, that something had been standing in his position for 40 minutes, wearing the right vest, the right hard hat, a face like a dry riverbed, and holding a sign with no words. I have wondered in the months since whether the blank sign paddle means something, whether the absence of the word stop or SLOW, whatever it should have said, was an accident of imperfect mimicry, or whether it was something else. Whether a thing that can copy the shape and the equipment and the position well enough to fool an experienced traffic control tech from a quarter-mile away, but produces a blank paddle, is making a kind of statement. Not stop, not slow, nothing. As if the idea of directing traffic, of managing the flow of human activity down a human road, was a concept it had observed carefully and replicated faithfully, but had never fully understood the point of. As if the sign was a prop. As if the whole performance was a prop. There is a thought I keep coming back to, and I am going to say it even though it sounds like something you'd dismiss if you hadn't been there. The south end of a lane closure is the position that faces outward. It faces away from the work, away from the crew, away from the lights. It faces the open road and the dark. A flagger on the south end spends the shift looking out, away from everything human and toward everything that might come up from the distance. Whatever was standing at that position on State Route 93 at 11:25 p.m. on that November night was not warning traffic, it was watching. It had put itself in the position that faces outward, and it had been there, in the dark, watching the desert, watching the Joshua trees, watching the highway unreeling south into the black. Long before I looked south and saw it. I have worked 32 night shifts on that section of 93 since then, and I have not seen the figure again. The crew moves faster through that stretch than they used to, and nobody talks about why. There is something in the high desert east of the Hualapai Mountains that has been watching the highway long enough to learn what a flagger looks like. It learned the vest. It learned the hard hat. It learned the position and the sign and the stance. What it did not learn was the movement, the small, constant adjustments of a cold human body just trying to make it to the end of a shift. That is always the tell. The absolute, inhuman stillness of something that has copied the outside of a thing and has no reason to simulate the inside. If you work night construction, highway, utility, rail, any of it, and you see a person at a position that should not be staffed, do not approach on foot. Do not leave your vehicle. Get inside your work zone lighting as a group. Compress your perimeter and call it in so the documentation exists. The documentation matters even when nobody believes what you wrote. If you hear a familiar voice on a closed channel, when the person that voice belongs to is standing right next to you, set down the radio. Whatever is on the other end of that transmission is not practicing communication. It is practicing recognition. It wants to know if the voice works. And if you confirm that it does, you have given it something it did not have before. I'm not supposed to release what came across the radio at 3:14 a.m. on that shift. My supervisor made that clear the morning after, and the county communications director made it clear, still in a follow-up meeting that involved more people than I expected, and a non-disclosure form that I signed because I still had a mortgage and 2 kids in middle school, and I did not see a practical alternative. I am telling you this anyway because my supervisor was not the one sitting alone in that room when it started talking back, and the non-disclosure form said nothing about oral accounts. And I have spent 2 years trying to decide whether keeping quiet about this serves anyone. I have concluded that it does not. My name is Grant. I worked overnight dispatch at the Graham County Sheriff's Office substation in Safford, Arizona for 11 years. Safford sits in the Gila Valley at roughly 3,000 feet elevation, flanked by the Pinaleno Mountains to the south and the Gila River running east to west through the valley floor. The Pinalenos rise to over 10,000 feet in less than 15 miles of horizontal distance from the valley floor, a dramatic vertical lift that creates its own weather, its own ecosystems, its own sound environment when the wind comes off them at night. From the substation parking lot, on a cold, clear March night, you could see the dark mass of them against the stars, enormous and close, the upper ridgelines occasionally catching a reflection of moonlight off the snow that persisted at elevation through March and into April. I had looked at those mountains from that parking lot for 11 years, and I had never had a feeling from them I could not account for until the night I am describing. Safford is a working agricultural town. Cotton, corn, cattle, with a population around 10,000 and a county the size of a small eastern state that the sheriff's office covers, with somewhere around 40 sworn deputies on a good staffing year. The overnight shift at the Safford substation, which handled the Eastern Valley and the SR-70 corridor up into the White Mountains foothills, ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. with typically one dispatcher, me and a duty sergeant who rotated between the main Safford station and the substation on a loose supervisory schedule that meant I was effectively alone in the building. For the majority of most shifts, I liked the overnight shift. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters to the story. I was not a person who struggled with solitude or dark hours or the particular quality of quiet that a rural dispatch center has between midnight and 4 a.m. when the calls are sparse and the radio traffic is mostly deputies running plates or checking welfare on a vehicle parked somewhere unusual. I had a rhythm to it. I knew the roads. I knew the regular callers. I knew which deputies were likely to need backup on a domestic call and which ones would handle a livestock on roadway without any support. I was good at the job. 11 years of good at it. The night this happened was a Tuesday in early March. The Gila Valley in early March is cold in a specific way. The overnight lows drop into the high 20s on clear nights, which in that low desert scrub means frost on the vehicle hoods by 2 a.m. and a sky that is almost aggressively clear, the Milky Way visible from the substation parking lot on nights when the town's light footprint wasn't too strong. I had come on at 10 p.m., done my handoff with the evening dispatcher, a woman named Lorraine who had nothing unusual to report, and settled into what promised to be a quiet Tuesday night. The substation itself was a converted county building on the east side of Safford, a single-story cinder block structure with a communications room that held the dispatch console, 3 radio terminals feeding 3 separate talk groups, patrol, fire, EMS, mutual aid, and the interagency coordination channel, a small break room, and a back office where the duty sergeant worked when he was in. The building sat on about half an acre of fenced gravel with 2 parking spaces marked for official vehicles and a row of sodium vapor security lights on the perimeter. The lights were old, and 2 of them had been cycling, flickering through their warm-up cycle randomly for about 3 weeks before maintenance finally replaced the ballasts. I had put in the maintenance request myself and had been logging the cycling lights in my shift notes each night they acted up, which made me methodical about it, the way you get methodical about building details after 11 years in the same building. I knew every sound it made, the hum of the HVAC unit on the roof, the way the front entry door settled in its frame when the temperature dropped after midnight and the metal contracted, The particular frequency of the fluorescent light in the break room that was slightly off from standard and produced a faint, high-pitched tone you stopped noticing after about an hour. I knew all of it. I was at home in that building in the way you can only be at home in a place you have occupied alone at night for over a decade. Between 10 p.m. and approximately 2:45 a.m., the shift was standard. 3 calls total a welfare check on SR 70 south of Pima that Morales cleared in under 10 minutes, a noise complaint from a residential address in the valley that generated a report and nothing further, and a livestock call 2 miles east of Safford on the county road that a deputy handled in under 20 minutes and logged as 1 cow, recovered, gate repaired. The radio traffic between those calls was the usual rhythm of deputies running plates, checking in at the hour, the occasional question to dispatch about an address or a vehicle registration. The valley was quiet and cold, and the frost was coming in hard off the mountains to the south, and through the blinds of the communications room I could see the orange halos of the parking lot sodium lamps diffusing in the moisture that had started to condense on the cold air after 2 a.m. I was good on that shift. I was alert, caffeinated, doing the job the way I had done it for 11 years. I say this because everything that came afterward has made me question what I know about my own perceptions, and I want to put on record that my perceptions on that shift were intact and accurate until something external came and made use of them. At 2:45, I heard the first anomaly. It came through on the interagency coordination channel, the third terminal, the one we use for communication with neighboring counties and state agencies when incidents crossed jurisdictional boundaries. That channel ran quieter than patrol on a typical night. On a Tuesday night in early March, it might carry no traffic at all between midnight and 6 a.m. I monitored it as a matter of protocol, but I was not expecting anything from it. What came through at 2:45 was a burst of static, brief, about 2 seconds, followed by what sounded like a voice. I could not resolve the words. The signal was too degraded, too flat, like something transmitting from the far edge of its range, or from equipment that was not calibrated correctly for the channel. But the cadence of it was unmistakably human speech. A sentence, maybe two, broken by interference. Then nothing. I logged it precisely. 2:45 a.m. Interagency Coordination Channel, unidentified transmission, low signal quality, content indeterminate. Adjacent county dispatch sometimes bled over on that frequency in certain atmospheric conditions. Cold, still nights with low humidity created favorable propagation, and the march overnight in the Gila Valley was textbook for that kind of skip. I logged it, noted possible atmospheric bleed from a neighboring county, and went back to monitoring patrol. I poured coffee at 2:52 and took it back to the console. When I came back, I noted that the building felt quieter than it had before the HVAC had cycled off, which accounted for some of it, but the break room fluorescent had also apparently finally given out on its cycling hum, and their combined absence left the communications room feeling smaller and more contained than usual. 4 walls, 3 terminal screens, and the parking lot lights throwing pale orange lines through the blinds. I had sat in that room under those exact conditions hundreds of times. The silence was familiar, or it should have been. At 3:02 a.m., the coordination channel transmitted again. This time the signal was cleaner, significantly cleaner, and I recognized the voice. The voice on the channel was reciting what I immediately understood to be a distress summary, a missing hiker update. The specific hiker was a man named Russell Tate, 26 years old, who had been reported overdue on a solo day hike in the Pinaleno Mountains the previous Friday. The search had been running for 4 days at that point, coordinated between Graham County SAR, the U.S. Forest Service, and Arizona DPS. I had been the dispatcher for the initial missing persons report and had handled 3 shift briefings on the search status over the course of the week. I knew the case in detail, his name, his last known position on the South Face Trail, his physical description, the orange pack, the brown jacket, the search grid sectors, and their clearance status as of the most recent briefing. The voice was reciting Russell Tate's last known check-in call, not a summary, not a paraphrase. The transcript was in our incident file, and I had read it 3 times in 3 shift briefings, and the voice was delivering it back at me with the exact sentence breaks, the same geographic references in the same order, the same casual register Tate had used when he called his hiking partner from the ridgeline at approximately 1 p.m. the Friday he disappeared. The landmarks he described, the cloud-covered building to the west, his estimated time to the turnaround, all of it. The cadence was almost right. There was a very slight elongation to certain vowels, a flatness in the upper register of the voice that was near to correct, but built from slightly different components, like a mosaic that reads as coherent from distance and resolves into its individual pieces only when you are close enough to see where the edges don't quite match. I noticed the wrongness before I had language for what I was noticing. Something in me was already running an assessment before my conscious mind had caught up with it. I leaned toward the terminal. The signal was holding. I keyed my microphone on the coordination channel. Graham County Dispatch. Substation. Identify your unit and agency, please. The transmission continued for 3 more seconds and then stopped. Silence. I sat with my hand on the microphone for about 10 seconds and then called Deputy Morales on the patrol channel. Morales, you on SR-70? South of Pima, he said. All clear. I've got an unidentified transmission on interagency coordination. Possible search team frequency Blee from the Pinaleno SAR operation. You have any traffic from that net tonight? A pause. Negative. SAR went to rest camp at 2100. They're not running night searches. I noted that in the log and sat with it for a moment. SAR had stood down for the night at 9 p.m. Whatever had been transmitting on the coordination channel at 3:02 a.m. was not the search team. It was not an adjacent county bleeder. Those transmissions did not carry detailed case information. It was not a recording. Our system did not loop captured audio back through the terminals. I went through the list of explanations methodically, the way I had been trained to go through checklists, and I arrived at the bottom of the list without finding one that fit. At 3:14 a.m., the coordination channel opened again. I had my notepad out. I had my recorder running. I had activated the supplemental audio recorder that we used for quality assurance, the one that ran independent of the standard logging system, because I wanted a backup capture of whatever this was. The transmission began, and the voice was clearer than either of the previous 2. Cleaner signal, closer or stronger, or both. It was my voice. I want to be careful about how I say this because I want to be precise. It was not a recording of my voice. I had not made any transmission on the coordination channel that night, and the system would not replay my own traffic back at me under any technical configuration I was aware of. It was my voice in the way that a very accurate impression of your voice would be your voice if you heard it cold, without context, on a radio. The pitch was right. The speech cadence was close. Not identical. There was a very slight elongation to the vowels that I don't have, a quality to the consonants that was near but not exact. But if you played it for someone who knew my voice from radio communication and did not tell them what to expect, I believe they would identify it as me. My voice on the coordination channel was saying, Russell Tate, Pinaleno Mountains, still there. 3 words. Still there. Then the channel dropped. I did not key my microphone. I did not respond. I sat in the chair and I listened to the particular quality of the silence after the transmission, and I did the thing I had trained myself to do in the 11 years of overnight shifts when something came through that did not fit any category. I made my hands be still on the console, and I breathed and I thought about process. Process was the thing. Log it. Contact the duty supervisor. Document the anomaly before you try to explain it. Whatever it was on the record now. Then I heard the sound outside. The substation's back wall faced a stretch of county land that ran down to an arroyo, maybe 200 yards to the south. There was nothing back there except the security light perimeter and the fence line, and beyond that the desert scrub. and at 3:14 in the morning there was no reason for there to be any sound from that direction. What I heard was not dramatic. It was not the sound of something forcing entry or something large moving through the brush. It was a footstep on gravel. One deliberate, unhurried footstep on the gravel apron outside the back wall, maybe 15 feet from where I was sitting. The kind of step a person takes when they are not trying to be quiet, because they have decided that quiet is not something they need to bother with. I called Morales on patrol. I kept my voice level. "Morales, I need you to make a loop by the substation. Something on the perimeter. Probably nothing, but I'd like eyes on it." "Copy," he said. 10 minutes. 10 minutes is not a long time under most circumstances. At 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, alone in a building at the edge of a dark valley with the Pinaleno Mountains rising to the south and one footstep's worth of sound on the gravel outside your wall, 10 minutes is substantial. I did not get up from the console. I did not go to the window to look. I have been trained in a general professional sense to do the controlled thing, the documented thing, the thing that produces a record, and the controlled thing was to stay at the console, monitor all 3 channels, and wait for my deputy to arrive. So that is what I did. What I noticed in those 10 minutes, sitting very still in the lit room, was that the gravel outside did not produce any further footstep sounds. One step, then nothing. No retreat, no approach, no movement. Whatever had stepped on that gravel had arrived at a position outside the back wall and remained there without sound. I have a particular relationship with silence from 11 years of overnight work, and I can tell you that the silence outside that back wall for the next 10 minutes was not the silence of an empty parking lot. It was the silence of something that had stopped moving because it had reached where it wanted to be and had no need to move further. The coordination channel opened one more time. My voice, again. Cleaner than any of the previous transmissions. Clear the way a person's voice is clear when they are close to a microphone. When they are perhaps 15 feet from where you are sitting. "Grant," it said. And then my last name. I have heard my own voice many times in recordings, in playback, in the particular strange dissonance of hearing yourself speak in video. I know what I sound like from the outside. What I heard on that terminal did not sound like me the way a recording sounds like you. It sounded like me the way a reflection sounds, the right shape assembled from the right components, oriented correctly in every measurable way, and wrong in the way that only becomes apparent when you understand that what you are looking at came from outside rather than inside. It said my full name with my voice, and the name was right, and the voice was almost right, and the combination of those two near correctnesses added up to something that was precisely and completely wrong. I have thought about it many times since, and I believe that wrongness was the point. I believe it was a demonstration, not a mistake. I did not respond. The exterior sodium vapor light directly behind the back wall, the one that had been cycling and flickering for 3 weeks, the one I had put in the maintenance request for, the one I had logged in my shift notes 8 times, went out, not in its warm-up cycle pattern, not the gradual dim and flutter of a cycling ballast. It went out the way a light goes out when someone throws the switch. Complete, instant. The section of gravel apron it covered went fully dark. I rotated my chair to put my back against the main console and face the interior door. I turned on every overhead fixture in the communications room that I could reach from the console. The room went bright and flat, and I sat in the center of it, and I put my hand on my sidearm, not drawing it, just making contact with it the way you make contact with a reliable thing when other things become unreliable, and I waited. Morales pulled into the front lot at 3:26 a.m. I watched his headlights on the exterior camera, and I did not feel the tension in my shoulders release until I saw his unit's overhead light bar come on and the lot flood with red and blue and white. He killed the lights after a few seconds, no need for the display at that hour, but the headlights stayed on, and that was enough. He did a full walk of the perimeter before he came inside, flashlights sweeping the gravel apron methodically, checking the fence, checking the back wall, checking the blown sodium lamp. He was out there for 12 minutes. I watched him on the exterior camera the entire time, and I did not take my hand off the console. He came in through the front entry and locked the door behind him, and he stood in the doorway of the communications room and looked at me. With the flat, professional expression that I recognized from his better years on the job, the look that meant he was putting what he had just seen outside into a category alongside what I had just told him on the radio. And the category was not a comfortable one, but it was a functional one, which was what we needed. Gravel's disturbed on the south apron, he said. Not prints, exactly. More like drag marks. 2 of them parallel, about shoulder width, starting at the fence line, ending at the wall. Like something moving toward the building. Like something that wasn't picking its feet up, he said. And the lamp. Blown. Filaments gone. Glass is intact. He paused. He was looking at the coordination terminal when he said this, not at me. I've seen lamps blow from power surges. This one looks different. Looks deliberate. He was quiet for a beat, and then, I'm going to stay until day shift. He stayed. He pulled the duty sergeant's chair from the back office and set it against the wall of the communications room, and he sat in it for the remaining 2.5 hours of the shift, and we did not talk very much. At 4 a.m. I played him the supplemental recorder audio, all 3 transmissions, including the one that used my voice to say my name. He listened to the recording twice without speaking. When it finished the second time, he asked how long between the time I had first keyed up on the coordination channel and the time it said my name. I did the math out loud. 29 minutes. He nodded in a slow, confirming way, as if he had been calculating something quietly, and this answer was consistent with what he'd arrived at. He did not elaborate on what that calculation was, and I did not ask. Don't key up on that channel again tonight, he said. I did not. And we sat together in the fully lit communications room and monitored the channels until Lorraine came on at 6 a.m. and the winter sun came over the Pinolinos and turned the frost on the parking lot vehicles to steam. And Morales gathered his jacket and his keys and walked out to his unit without looking at the back wall, and I understood that decision completely. He filed a supplemental incident report that morning before he went off duty. It documented the disturbed gravel, the blown lamp, and his observation that the disturbance pattern was inconsistent with known wildlife activity in the area. It was filed as part of the broader incident record under my initial log entry. Graham County Sheriff's Office, incident number GCSO 77321. The supplemental is in there if anyone ever pulls the file. It says what it says in the language it had to say it in, and between the lines of that language is everything Morales saw when he walked the south apron at 3:26 in the morning and did not look at the back wall when he left. The morning debrief involved my watch, commander, the communications director, and, in a capacity that was never fully explained to me, a man from the State Department of Public Safety who had driven up from Tucson before 7 a.m. and who asked questions that told me he was familiar with things that were not in any manual I had access to. He had the easy professional manner of someone who had heard similar accounts enough times to have developed a neutral relationship with them. He did not express skepticism, and he did not express alarm. He took notes on a pad he kept angled away from me, and he asked several questions about the specific phrasing of each transmission, the word choices, the sentence order, the particular wrongness in the vowels that were more specific than a general technical investigation would require. He knew what to ask. That knowledge did not reassure me. He was the one who told me, quietly, after the formal debrief was concluded and the other officials had left the room, that the transmission logs from the coordination channel for the entire shift had been reviewed and showed no incoming traffic after 11 p.m. Whatever the supplemental recorder had captured was not present in the official system log. There was a technical explanation for this that he outlined briefly and that I understood well enough to know it did not actually explain it. He thanked me for my professionalism in documenting the incident correctly and asked me not to discuss the transmission content with anyone outside the department. He also told me that Russell Tate's remains were located 2 days later in a drainage on the south face of the Pinoleno Range, approximately 3 miles outside the active search grid. The recovery team's notes described the site as unusual in several respects that were not elaborated in the formal report. I did not ask for elaboration. I had enough. The non-disclosure form I signed covered the specifics of the transmission content and the coordination channel records. It did not cover my memory of sitting alone in a lit room at 3:14 in the morning while something stood 15 feet away in the extinguished dark outside my back wall and used my own voice to say my name into a frequency it had no business operating on. There is something I want to say about the sequence of the 3 transmissions before I get to the survival rule, because I think the sequence is the most important part, and I have not seen it discussed anywhere in the way I think it deserves to be discussed. The first transmission, at 2:45, was degraded and unresolvable, a voice I could not identify saying words I could not make out. I logged it and moved on. The second transmission, at 3:02, was clear enough to identify as a voice reciting Russell Tate's check-in call specific case content that it had no legitimate access to, delivered in a voice that was almost but not quite right. And the third transmission, at 3:14, was my own voice saying my name. Each one was cleaner than the last. Each one was closer. The progression was not random, and it was not a malfunction. It was a process. It was learning in real time across 29 minutes what it needed to sound like to produce a result. The first transmission tested whether I would respond to an unidentified voice. I did. I logged it and kept monitoring, which told it I was present and alert. The second tested whether I would respond to a voice using case-specific information on a frequency it should not have access to. I keyed up and asked for identification. That transmission gave it the full clarity of my voice at professional radio volume, close range, on a quiet channel. The third used what it had collected. My voice, my name, delivered from 15 feet away through a frequency that should have been empty. It was not an accident that the progression ended with my name. It was a conclusion. I have thought about what it was practicing in those 29 minutes between my first transmission and the one that used my voice. Whether it needed to hear itself doing it before it could do it in a context where the result would matter more. Whether the Russell Tate check-in call was a demonstration, a way of showing me that it had access to what had been said on these frequencies, that it understood the content of what moved through the radio, that it had been listening longer than I knew. Whether still there meant Tate's location, whether it meant something else, whether the something else is what I think it means when I am awake at 3 in the morning and cannot get back to sleep. I left the overnight shift 18 months after this happened. I did not leave, only because of the fear, though that was part of it. I left because I had stopped being able to sit at that console at 3 a.m. and hear static on the coordination channel without my hands going still in the wrong way, the careful way. And that kind of careful is not compatible with doing dispatch correctly. Dispatch requires a particular form of calm. The form I had maintained for 11 years. I could not get it back. I do the day shift now, out of the main Safford station. Lorraine has the overnight at the substation. She is good at the job, and I have not told her what happened in that room. She deserves to stay good at it. If you work alone in a communication center or anywhere you monitor radio traffic overnight in a building that sits at the edge of open country and you hear an unidentified transmission on a channel that should be silent, log it, timestamp it, run your supplemental recorder. Do not key your microphone in response. Do not say anything back to it. The mistake I made was answering at 2:45 a.m. when the signal was degraded and the content was nothing. By the time it had my full name at 3:14, it had been listening to me work for 29 minutes. 29 minutes was apparently enough to produce something it thought would work. It was close. That is what keeps me up. It was very close. That was the last shift I ever worked in Kayenta. I didn't quit. I didn't get fired. I just never went back, and nobody who was there that night blamed me. I need to say at the start that I grew up on the Navajo Nation. I was born in Tuba City and raised partly there and partly in Kayenta. And I came back to Kayenta after 2 years at community college in Flagstaff because my mother needed help with some things, and because a night crew position opened at the grocery store, and because I thought I knew that country well enough to be comfortable in it at any hour. I knew the land, I knew the roads, I knew the particular dark that falls over that part of the nation on a moonless winter night, when the stars over Monument Valley are dense enough to look like something poured out across the sky, and the sandstone formations to the east are just darker shapes against a dark background, three-dimensional, only when the moonlight catches their upper faces. I had grown up in that dark. I had driven those roads at 2 and 3 in the morning and stood outside in January and listened to the absolute still of the desert air with no anxiety about it. I was not afraid of the dark in that country. I understood it as a familiar thing. I want to be very clear about this because what I am going to describe happened in a place I knew, to a person who was not prone to fear of the environment he was working in, at a job he was competent at, in a community he was part of, in a building he had worked in for 7 months without incident. I say all of this because I have told this story before, and the first thing people reach for is the explanation that it was the isolation or the strangeness of the landscape affecting my judgment. It was not. I was calm and competent and at home in that place, and it happened anyway. The grocery store in Kayenta is one of the only full-service grocery stores within 60 miles in any direction. That sounds like a context detail, but it is actually the most important practical fact about working there, because it means the store runs hard. It runs hard during the day, and it runs hard during the night, because the restocking has to happen overnight, so the shelves are full when the morning customers come in, and the morning customers start early, and there is no slack in the timeline. The store sits on the south side of US 160, the main highway through that part of the nation, and the back of the building faces open land that runs south toward the valley and the mesa country, without any significant structure between the store's exterior wall and the horizon. At night, that open land has a quality you feel more than you see a presence to the emptiness, a sense that the space behind the building is not passive. I had loaded dock pallets against that back wall 100 times over 7 months, and I had always been aware of it. The November air coming off that open ground had a specific mineral cold to it, dusty and dry, and sometimes in still conditions you could catch something on it that I could not have named, but that I recognized as desert in a way that went below any description I had words for. That quality was present that night, from the moment I walked across the parking lot at 11 p.m. to start my shift. I noticed it, and I cataloged it, and I went inside and started my count sheets, and I did not think about it again until it gave me a reason to. The crew that night was 3 people. Me, a woman named Ruthie who had been on nights for 2 years and knew the stockroom inventory better than the store manager did, and a man named Pat who handled the frozen and refrigerated sections because he was the only one of us who didn't mind the cold for extended stretches. Ruthie was in her early 30s, had grown up in the Kayenta area, and had the specific calm competence of a person who had been doing physical overnight work long enough that she no longer needed to think about the mechanical parts of it. We got along well because we had the same approach to the work. Steady, systematic, keep the count sheets clean, don't let the stockroom slip behind. Pat was quieter, did his sections without much conversation, checked in by radio every hour. The overnight manager, Leon, worked out of the front office and did perimeter walkthroughs every 2 hours, on a schedule I could have set a watch by. 4 people in a building that went very quiet once the last evening customer left, and the front doors locked at 11. The winter nights in Kayenta are cold and still in a specific way. The elevation is about 5,600 feet, and in December the overnight temperatures drop into the teens on clear nights. And the desert floor holds the cold differently than it holds the heat. It radiates it back upward, so the air 6 inches off the ground is colder than the air at shoulder height. And if you go outside, you can feel the cold rising from the pavement through your boots before the air temperature even registers. I had done loading dock work in that cold enough times to know the procedure, prop the dock door for as little time as possible, stage the pallets close to the entrance, work fast. The dock faced north, which meant it got almost no solar exposure during the day and retained the cold from the previous night well into the afternoon. Even in summer, the dock stayed 10 degrees cooler than the parking lot. In December, it was a different matter entirely. We had a delivery of dry goods and canned product that had come in that afternoon and still needed to be broken down and floor stocked. Ruthie and I took the main grocery sections while Pat worked his cold aisles. It was routine. We were maybe 2 hours into the shift, somewhere around 1 a.m., when Ruthie said she needed to check the back stock count on a canned goods item and headed toward the stockroom. I was working the breakfast cereal aisle. I had the box cutter, the cart, the count sheet, the whole setup, and I was in the rhythm of it, that particular low focus, competent state where the hands do the work and the mind runs lighter. The fluorescent lighting in the ceiling was the regular institutional buzz, steady and flat, and outside the walls it was fully dark and fully silent, and I was not thinking about that. At approximately 1:15 a.m. I heard a sound from the loading dock area. The loading dock was separated from the main stockroom by a heavy insulated door that we kept closed during overnight shifts to maintain the stockroom temperature. The dock itself was accessed through that door and then through a second door that opened directly onto the dock platform and the parking area behind the store. Both doors were supposed to be closed and locked after the last delivery acceptance of the day, which happened by 8 p.m. I had checked both doors as part of my 11 p.m. start routine, the same way I checked them every night, hand on the handle, visual confirmation of the bar lock, note in the clipboard log. Both were secure. The sound I heard was a knock, not on the insulated stockroom door, on the exterior dock door, the one that opened onto the platform. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, deliberate, the kind of knocking a person does when they expect to be heard and they expect someone to answer. Confident knocking. The sound carried cleanly through the insulated door and through the stockroom wall, and reached me in the cereal aisle without any ambiguity about what it was. 3 knocks at 1:15 in the morning on the loading dock of a grocery store in Kayenta in December. I stood with my box cutter in my hand for a moment, and I ran through the reasonable explanations in order. A delivery driver arriving impossibly late, and at the wrong door. The delivery entrance had a buzzer for exactly this scenario, and nobody ever knocked. One of the exterior door frames settling in the cold possible, except that the dock door was metal and the frame was concrete block, and that combination did not produce 3 evenly spaced sounds. A maintenance issue I hadn't been notified about possible, except it was 1:15 a.m. I went through the list, and the list came up short, and I went to the stockroom door and stood against it and listened. Nothing further. The dock side was quiet. I went back and found Ruthie near the canned goods shelving and told her what I had heard. She looked at me for a long second and said, "Was it 3? 3 knocks?" I said. Even spacing. Her expression changed in a specific way. Not fear exactly, not yet, but a kind of settling. A weight coming into her face that told me this was not an entirely new category of information for her. She had grown up here too. She had been doing overnight shifts at this store for 2 years. "I'm going to get Leon," she said. I told her I would check the dock door camera from the stockroom monitor while she got Leon. The stockroom had a small monitor mounted near the manager's desk that showed the exterior dock camera feed, a fixed wide-angle unit covering the platform and the immediate parking area. I pulled it up. The dock platform was empty. The security flood on the rear of the building was working, casting its harsh white-orange across the concrete and the first 20 feet of the parking area. Beyond that circle, dark and flat and still. The camera showed nothing on the platform, nothing in the lit area. Whatever had knocked had done so from a surface it apparently chose not to remain on. Leon came back with Ruthie. He looked at the monitor, went through the insulated door, cracked the exterior dock door, looked out. He was on camera for 15 seconds. He came back in and reported the platform clear. He said cold air was probably causing the metal door to contract and produce sounds. It was a reasonable explanation. It was not an adequate one, but it was the one we had, and we went back to work. At 2:30 a.m., Ruthie came to find me in the soup aisle. I could see the change in her face before she spoke, the controlled calm of someone maintaining composure by deliberate effort rather than ease. "There's someone outside the dock window," she said. The dock window was a small fixed pane set into the stockroom wall beside the exterior dock door, 8 inches wide, 12 inches tall, placed at head height so dock workers could see the platform before opening the door. You would not notice it from the main stockroom unless you happened to be near that section of wall. Ruthie had been near it. "What do you mean, someone?" I said, standing at the window, looking in. We got Leon, and the three of us went to the stockroom. Leon looked through the window first. He stepped back. He looked at me and Ruthie. He looked at the window again. He said, "The platform's clear." His voice was level, but something in it had shifted slightly from the administrative calm he had been maintaining since the knocking. I looked through the window. The dock platform was empty. The security flood was working. The frost-dusted concrete was bare and still. Nothing at the window, nothing on the platform, nothing visible in the lit area. But on the frost below the window, on the concrete directly beneath the pane, where a person would stand to look through it, there were 2 areas of compressed frost. Not full prints, not clear enough to swear to in a report, but 2 sections where the frost was compacted flat and dense in a pattern consistent with something standing still, fully weighted in the position that window required. The edges of the compression were sharp and clean, the way frost compacts under sustained weight and not the way it disturbs under a passing step. Something had stood there long enough to compress it. And then it was gone, without any of the 3 of us seeing it leave. Leon told us to go back to the main floor. He went through the full dock check, both doors, the exterior, the camera, the platform. He found nothing further. He came back in, and he did not say everything was fine. He said, "Finish your sections and stay on the main floor. I'll do the dock checks myself until open." We did not discuss what we had seen. There was a kind of communal agreement in the way the 3 of us, me, Ruthie, Leon, returned to the main floor and went back to our sections without talking through it. In this community, you learn certain things early about what gets said out loud and what gets held quietly, and what we had seen in those frost impressions was the kind of thing that fell into the second category. Not because it wasn't real, because saying it out loud in the middle of a shift, you still had 5 hours left on in a building sitting on the open south edge of a mesa at 2:30 in the morning, served no practical function. We knew what we knew. We kept working. Ruthie and I worked through the soup aisle and into the condiments section. Pat came off his cold aisle and restocked the deli area. The store was quiet in the way. It was always quiet at that hour. The refrigeration units cycling in their steady rhythm, the heating pushing warm air through the ceiling vents, the fluorescent fixtures humming their single institutional note, normal sounds, expected sounds. I was cataloging them without noticing I was cataloging them, the way you do when your nervous system is running a background check on the environment and your conscious mind is occupied with count sheets and box cutters. At 3:40 a.m., I was in the frozen foods aisle. I want to describe the frozen foods section of that store because the layout matters. It was a long aisle running along the back wall of the main sales floor, lined on both sides with upright glass door freezer units. The units had interior lights that were always on a cold blue-white that lit the aisle from both sides and created a visual corridor that was brighter than the main floor overheads in some sections because the units were double-banked and their combined output was substantial. It was one of the brightest parts of the store at night. Clear, cold, well-lit. I had been in that aisle dozens of times on overnight shifts, and it had always felt like one of the more contained sections of the store, all that glass and interior light creating the specific visual comfort of being able to see everything around you. I was facing the freezer units, restocking breakfast items in the section nearest to the back wall, and the glass doors of the units in front of me were throwing my reflection back at me in the blue-white light and in that reflection I could also see the length of the aisle behind me. Something was standing at the far end of the aisle. I registered it in the reflection before I processed what I was registering: a figure at the entrance to the frozen food section, at the point where the aisle opened onto the main floor, standing still. The light from both banks of freezer units hit it from either side, and the reflection showed me a silhouette that I looked at for approximately 2 seconds before the wrongness of it resolved into something my brain could name. Too tall. Not dramatically, not in the cartoonish way you imagine when someone describes a figure that is too tall. Just wrong in the register of proportions that the human eye is calibrated to read at a glance, the way you know a door frame is hung crooked before you measure it. The head was too high, the shoulders too wide for the height. The arms hung at a length that did not match the trunk. And it was absolutely still not the stillness of someone standing and thinking, but the complete motionlessness I had seen in the frost impressions on the dock platform, present and weightless at the same time. I turned around. The aisle was empty. I stood very still and looked at the entrance to the frozen foods section for 3 seconds. Nothing. The main floor beyond was quiet and normally lit, and nothing was standing there, nothing was moving, nothing was anywhere I could see. I did not assume I had imagined it. I did not offer myself the comfortable explanation. I picked up my radio, and I kept my voice level and professional, in the way Leon had been doing since 1:15 a.m., because the only thing I had to offer my coworkers at that moment was a calm voice on the radio. "Ruthie, where are you? Cereal. Why? Stay there." I looked at the aisle entrance again. "Is Pat on the floor?" "He went to break 10 minutes ago." "He's in the break room." So Pat was in the break room, and Ruthie was in cereal, and Leon was in the front office, and the figure in the reflection had been none of them, and it was not a customer, and it was not a delivery driver, and the building was locked. And then, from somewhere on the main floor between me and the cereal aisle, not from Ruthie's direction, not from the front office, not from the break room hallway, I heard Ruthie's voice say my name, not over the radio, from the floor, from the air, from approximately 20 feet away in the direction of the main aisle. I keyed the radio immediately. Ruthie. Her voice came back on the radio from the cereal aisle, tight but controlled. That wasn't me. I will tell you that the voice had been very close to right. It had the specific quality of Ruthie's voice, the register, the way she shaped her consonants, the slight accent that northern Arizona puts in certain vowel sounds. It was close enough that my first physical response before I had thought about it was to orient toward it the way you orient toward someone who has called your name. It activated the automatic response before the analytical response could override it. That is the part that stays with me, not that it sounded like Ruthie, but that it sounded like Ruthie enough to move my body before my brain caught up. It was not close enough in the end. There was a flatness to it, a single-note quality that Ruthie's voice did not have, the specific register of a thing produced rather than expressed, assembled rather than felt, but it was close. It had been building toward it since 1:15 a.m., and it had gotten close enough to trigger the response it was after, before I overrode it. I walked to the cereal aisle and found Ruthie standing in the middle of it, with her radio in, her hand and her back against the shelving unit so she could see both ends of the aisle at once. She looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment because there was a specific thing that needed saying, and neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud in a locked building at 3:40 in the morning. Then she said, "We need to get Leon, and we need to get to the front of the store." We got Leon. We told him what had happened, my account of the figure in the frozen foods reflection, Ruthie's confirmation on the radio that the voice had not come from her, the direction the voice had come from relative to our positions on the floor. Leon listened to all of it, standing very still with his arms crossed. He did not challenge any of it. He went to the break room and got Pat, and he brought all four of us to the front checkout area, and then he went to the breaker panel on the north wall of the stock room, and he put the store on full overheads. Not the standard overnight setting, which left half the banks off for efficiency, all of them. The display lights, the cleaning lights, the backup bank over the bakery, the full security setting that made the store look the way it looked at noon on a Saturday. The frozen foods aisle in particular went from cold blue white to hard institutional white, every corner and angle of it lit flat and exposed. Nowhere to stand that the light did not reach. We did not go back to our sections. We stayed at the front of the store together under the overheads, and Leon made 2 calls. The first was to Navajo Nation Police Dispatch. The second was on his personal cell phone, not the store's landline, not his work phone, but his personal cell, which he took 3 steps away from us before he dialed, which was not a separation he needed to make for signal reasons. That call lasted about 4 minutes. I watched him during it. He spoke quietly, and he listened more than he talked, and at the end he nodded twice and said "understood" and ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment, looking at the floor, and then he came back to where the 3 of us were standing near the front checkout, and his expression had the specific quality of a person who has just received information that confirms something they already knew, but were hoping they were wrong about. He did not tell us who he had called. I did not ask. The Navajo Nation Police unit arrived at 4:15 a.m., 2 officers in a marked unit. They did a full exterior walk all 4 sides, the loading dock, both parking areas, the dumpster enclosure, and took about 20 minutes. They came back in, and one of them, a woman named Officer Yazzie, took a brief statement from Leon. They asked if anyone had been injured. Leon said no. They asked if anything had been taken or damaged. Leon said no. Officer Yazzie noted the frost compressions on the dock platform. They had partially reformed by this point, but the compacted areas were still visible as distinct textures in the frost, and photographed them. She wrote the incident number in her report, Navajo Nation Police, NNP 44913, and said they would note the location for increased patrols in the coming week. Before she left, she said something quietly to Leon near the front door. I was close enough to hear part of it. She said, "Make sure the exterior floods are all working before the next night shift." And then something I could not fully hear. And Leon said, "I know," in a way that told me the second part of what she had said was not new information to him. He nodded. She and her partner left. I noticed that Officer Yazzie did not look toward the frozen foods aisle when she walked through the store. She kept her eyes on Leon, on the front area, on the door. She did not look toward the back of the store. That was a deliberate choice. I recognized it as one because I was making the same choice, and I had been making it since 3:40 a.m. We finished the shift. The 4 of us stayed together on the main floor under the full overheads and completed what sections could be completed, and at 7 a.m. the morning crew came in and we went home. On my drive back, I watched my mirrors the entire way, not because I expected to see anything behind me, but because the habit had formed overnight and my body had not yet gotten the message that the building's walls were no longer the perimeter. The red country on either side of US 160 was just beginning to show its color as the sky lightened behind the mesa to the east, and the sandstone formations that I had grown up looking at all my life were the same red they had always been, and the land was the land it had always been. And none of that made me feel the way it usually did. I went back 2 weeks later for my last paycheck. Ruthie was working the day shift. She walked me to the door after I got the check, and she told me one more thing, that at the moment I had heard the voice say my name from the main floor. She had heard it too, from the cereal aisle, from the direction of the frozen foods section, which meant the voice had come from a point equidistant between us, positioned to reach both of us at once. It had been standing between us in the aisle we had both worked that night, and it had used Ruthie's voice toward me from the direction that would have made me look toward her, and it had done this at a moment when both of us were in positions where the sound would carry clearly and the source would be ambiguous. That was not accident. That was geometry. She said it the way you say something you have been holding for 2 weeks and have finally decided the other person has a right to know, and she said it without editorial comment, and I thanked her for telling me, and I walked to my car and I sat in it for a few minutes before I drove away. I did not ask her if she was still working overnight shifts. I did not want to know the answer if it was yes, and I did not want to make her feel bad if it was no. The thing about the Navajo Nation is that the land out there has memory. The people who have lived on it for 1,000 years know this. The Red Rock country around Kayenta and Monument Valley is some of the oldest continuously inhabited land on the continent, and some things that move through it have been moving through it for longer than the roads, longer than the buildings, longer than any structure a person has put up and called permanent. I grew up understanding that the dark in that country was not empty dark. I knew it. I thought that knowledge was protective. I thought knowing the thing existed meant I had some relationship with it that would translate into a margin. It does not. Knowing a thing exists does not protect you from it. Knowing the dark is not empty does not help you when something in the dark has learned your colleague's voice well enough to say your name with it from the middle of a freezer aisle at 3:40 in the morning. Familiarity with the threat is not the same as safety from it. If anything, familiarity makes you slower to react when the threat presents itself, in a way you recognize because recognition creates the half-second of delay, where you think you understand what you are dealing with before you understand. That understanding is not the same as being prepared. The night crew schedule at that store was changed the following month. Dock work was moved to an earlier window so all exterior door operations were completed before midnight. I heard this from Ruthie when I picked up my check, and I think Leon made that change because of what happened, and I think he would agree with me if asked, though I do not think he would agree in writing. There were 3 of us on that ridge when the shift started. By 4 a.m. there were only 2. The third one didn't leave, it was replaced. I need to explain what I mean by that carefully, because the distinction matters. When I say replaced, I don't mean someone left and someone else arrived. I mean the person who had been sitting at the north end of our watch line at midnight was not the same thing that was sitting at the north end of our watch line at 4 a.m., and the transition between those 2 states happened without any of us seeing it happen, without any of us hearing it happen, in a narrow corridor of time that our documentation places at somewhere between 50 minutes and an hour and 15 minutes on a ridgeline in a wilderness area where the nearest paved road was 2 miles below us, and the nearest other human being was Ortega, staged at the trailhead, with no reason to come up until we called her. We did not realize the transition had happened until the thing at the north end of the watch line did something the person it was imitating could not have done. That is the detail I keep returning to. Not that it replaced her, that it held the position for over an hour without giving itself away, that it was patient enough, or capable enough, or simply constituted in a way that made an hour of stillness in the cold unremarkable, and that if Holt had not been the specific kind of observer, he was the kind who tracks small details and holds them against their expected pattern without letting the baseline drift, we might not have noticed until something worse gave it away. My name is Brett. I work as a field support tech for a private wildland fire contractor out of Payson, Arizona. I'm not a hotshot, not a smoke jumper. I'm the support side of the operation, equipment, staging, communications, relay, post-burn monitoring. I've been doing this work for 9 years, and a significant portion of it has been overnight watches on ridgelines after prescribed burns or managed fires, when the Forest Service needs eyes on the ground through the dark hours to catch any rekindles before they get established. It is unglamorous work. It involves sitting on a ridge with a radio and a thermal scope and a lot of coffee, watching a burn area for heat signatures that shouldn't be there, and it requires the specific skill of staying alert through hours when alertness is not naturally what your body wants to offer. I am good at it. I have a clean 9-year track record on watches, and I don't have a history of incidents, anomaly reports, or problems with my documentation or field judgment. I want that on the record before I tell you what happened in the Mazatzal wilderness in the fall of 2022. The prescribed burn we were watching had come off the previous day on a section of the upper Mazatzal. Drainage northwest of the Four Peaks wilderness boundary inside Tonto National Forest. The burn unit was about 300 acres of mixed chaparral and juniper on a south-facing slope, the kind of fuel load that carries well and burns clean and leaves a good char that holds for weeks. The Mazatzal Wilderness sits east of the Rim Country and north of the Phoenix Basin, a roadless area of rough volcanic ridgelines and steep drainages that is one of the less visited wilderness areas in Arizona. The terrain is abrupt and the elevation change is significant. The nights at elevation in late October are legitimately cold. Not cold the way a January night in the Rockies is cold, but cold enough that gear choices matter, and cold enough that sitting still on an exposed ridge for 8 hours without proper insulation becomes a medical problem rather than a comfort one. The operations team had called the burn, complete at 6 p.m., and the dozer lines were confirmed holding. The Forest Service burn boss, a woman named Ortega, wanted overnight eyes on the north corner of the unit, where the black met a section of unburned manzanita that was dry enough to concern her if any ember transport had sent material past the dozer line during the afternoon wind event. The wind had run southeast to northwest in the afternoon, which was favorable for the burn but put the north interface at risk for spotting into the unburned fuel. Standard post-burn watch protocol. 2-person minimum. Radio contact with Phoenix Interagency Dispatch Center every 2 hours. Thermal scope sweep every 30 minutes. Call anything that looks active. My watch partner was a man named Holt. Holt had been working fire support for 12 years, southern Arizona and New Mexico primarily. He was constitutionally unbothered, slow to alarm, precise in his observations. He did not jump to conclusions. He said what he saw, logged what he logged, and held his judgment until he had enough information to justify it. I have worked with a lot of people on overnight watches, and Holt is the standard I measure others against. I was glad he was there that night. I have been glad about it more specifically as the months since have passed. The third member of our watch was a woman named Ariel, a USFS resource advisor assigned to the Burn for Ecological Monitoring Post-Fire Soil and Vegetation Assessment. The overnight watch was somewhat outside her usual scope, but Ortega had asked her to stay on the watch line for the first half of the night to help establish the monitoring baseline. The north end of the watch line, closest to the Manzanita interface, was the section most relevant to her transect data, so she took the north position. Holt was in the center, and I was on the south end, nearest to the access road that climbed the ridge from the Barnhart trailhead area below. We established positions at 9 p.m. The Mazatzal Ridge, at 5,800 feet in late October, was in the mid-30s, by full dark with a light northwest wind that made it feel colder on the exposed granite spine of the ridge. I had on a base layer, fleece mid-layer, and a fire-resistant outer shell, and by midnight my coffee was gone, and my feet were telling me things I was declining to fully acknowledge. The sky was clear and moonless, and the burned section below the ridgeline showed the flat dark of the char, occasionally broken by a faint dull orange, where a root mass or buried log was still holding combustion underground. The thermal scope picked those up clearly on my sweeps every 30 minutes. Nothing concerning through the early hours of the watch. The dozer lines were holding clean. I want to describe what the ridge was like during those first hours because the contrast matters. From 9 p.m. to midnight, the watch had a specific quality that anyone who has done this kind of work will recognize: a sustainable alertness, a rhythm to the scope sweeps, the radio checks arriving and departing cleanly, the crew present and accounted for, and doing their individual pieces of the job. The burn below had its own sound when the wind came across it right, a faint ticking from cooling metal, and the occasional soft pop of retained combustion releasing, a sound unlike any other, that you only hear on a burn line the first night after the fire has passed through. It was cold and clear, and the work was straightforward, and the three of us were in our positions, and the night was the kind of long but manageable night that this job produces regularly. That was the baseline. I want you to have the baseline because what came after it requires the contrast to read correctly. The Mazatzal Range at night is deeply dark. No light pollution reaches the upper ridgelines from the valley below, and the nearest community is far enough that even on a clear night the horizon in all directions is unbroken blackness meeting stars. The wilderness designation means no roads inside the boundary, no structures, no permanent infrastructure of any kind. What exists in the Mazatzal at night is rock and chaparral and the drainage channels running toward the Salt River watershed, and whatever moves through it, and the occasional fire watch crew sitting on a granite spine at elevation trying to stay warm and awake until first light. We were the only people on that ridge. I was certain of that when we set up. I was less certain of it by 1:30 a.m. Ariel was at her north position throughout the evening, working her sampling forms between scope observations, calling data points quietly to herself, in a way I could hear as a low, indistinct voice down the ridge when the wind momentarily settled. Holt was quiet, the way Holt was always quiet, on watches present, attentive, steady. We checked in by radio at 10, 11, and midnight, brief and professional. The watch was proceeding exactly as it should have been. At midnight, Ariel radioed that she was stepping off position for 15 minutes to check a soil sampling point about 50 yards back from the watch line on the ridge. Interior. She had mentioned this possibility in the pre-watch briefing. I logged it precisely. 0000 hours. Resource advisor stepping off north position for soil sample check. Return estimated 0015. Holt acknowledged. I swept the burn line with the thermal and went back to monitoring. At 12:15, Ariel radioed that she was back on position. I logged it. Holt acknowledged. Everything was standard. At 1:30 a.m., Holt called me on the radio. Brett, when did Ariel get a new jacket? I looked north up the ridgeline. From my position on the south end, I could see Holt's silhouette in the faint ambient light of the stars and the residual glow from the burn below. And beyond him, at the north end of the line, I could see the third silhouette where Ariel's position was. I had been tracking that silhouette at irregular intervals all night, the way you track the positions of people you're working with, without consciously deciding to an automatic background check, the kind of peripheral awareness that builds up over hours of shared watchwork. She didn't change jackets, I said. She had the blue shell on all night. I know, Holt said. His voice was level in the specific way his voice was always level. And within that particular evenness, I could hear the thing that Holt only allowed himself when he had assessed a situation and found it required more than routine attention. I looked at the north position more carefully. The silhouette was there, in the right location, within a few yards of where Ariel had been sitting all evening. It appeared to be wearing something with a slightly different outline. The shoulder width was marginally greater, the collar profile slightly higher, the overall shape a degree off from what I had been tracking since 9 p.m. Not dramatically, the kind of difference you would explain as a lighting change or a shift in posture if you were looking for explanations, except that it was 1 a.m. on a dark ridge and the lighting had not changed, and a posture shift does not alter the shoulder width of a jacket. Ariel, I called on the radio. You okay up there? No response. Ariel, this is Brett. Radio check. Nothing. Holt's voice came on the channel, still at that careful level. She hasn't moved in about 40 minutes. Not at all. A person doing an overnight watch in cold conditions moves. This is physiologically necessary. You shift your weight every 15 or 20 minutes to maintain circulation. You adjust your position when the cold drives into your lower back or your knees. You stand up and pace when the alertness drops. You do these things without thinking about them because your body demands them, and if you try to stay completely still on a granite ridgeline in mid-30s, temperatures for 40 minutes, you will start to lose feeling in your feet before the 30-minute mark. 40 minutes of absolute stillness at 1:30 a.m. meant either that something had happened to Ariel, a medical event, a fall, something that had incapacitated her, or that what was sitting at the north end of our watch line was not subject to the physical demands that required Ariel to move. I radioed Phoenix Dispatch. I reported a crew member non-responsive at our watch position and requested supervisor response. They patched me to Ortega, who was staged at the trailhead parking lot below. She said she would start up the access road immediately. I told Holt I was coming north to the center position and we would approach the north end together, and whatever we found there we would approach it together. I took my headlamp off flood and put it on the tightest spot beam I had and walked north along the ridge to Holt's position. The ridge here was a narrow spine of decomposed granite with chaparral roots threading through the rock, the burned section dropping away to the east and the unburned manzanita falling to the west, and the northwest wind moving through the brush below produced a constant low friction sound that was the loudest thing on the ridge. My boots on the granite made no sound I could hear over it. The cold was serious, the kind that moves into your chest when you inhale and takes a moment to release when you exhale, and the glow from the burn below gave the eastern slope a faint amber cast that made the shadows on the ridge face into sharp contrasts. The juniper and manzanita on the western slope were dark, irregular shapes against the slightly lighter sky, and between those shapes and the empty ridge above them there was nothing moving. No wind-shifted branch, no animal crossing, nothing that accounted for itself, except the wind and the burn below and the two of us on the ridge and the thing 60 yards north that we had not yet decided how to name. Holt was standing when I reached him. You do not stand up on a cold ridge in the dark at 1:30 in the morning unless you have made a decision that standing is warranted. She's not answering direct calls either, he said quietly. His eyes were on the north position, and the posture is wrong. I looked north. The figure was approximately 60 yards from us, sitting in Ariel's position facing east over the burn area, the same orientation she had held for the entire watch. But the posture was wrong in the way Holt meant, and I understood immediately what he was describing because I had spent 4.5 hours passively registering how Ariel carried herself in her monitoring position, the slight forward lean when she was actively scanning, the weight distributed across both hands on the ground in front of her, the chin elevated to give her the sightline she needed. The figure at the north position was not sitting that way. It was sitting with a straightness and uniformity that suggested nothing about active monitoring or physical comfort or cold management. Every angle was held in exactly the same configuration it had been in the last time either of us had looked, the shoulders neither rising nor falling with breath, the head neither tilting nor adjusting. Completely still in the way that had nothing to do with discipline or intention and everything to do with not being subject to the things that make a body move. We're not going up there, I said. No, Holt said. We're not. We agreed on that without discussion, without hesitation, without any of the procedural back and forth that a different kind of situation might have required. We simply agreed, and we moved south together along the ridge spine back to my original position, and I kept my headlamp on the tightest spot beam and held it pointed north toward the figure at the watch line's north end. In that beam I could see the figure clearly enough to confirm what the thermal scope had shown me, no breath condensation visible in the cold air around it, no micro movements of the kind produced by a living respiratory system, no adjustment of weight, just the wrong jacket, in the wrong proportions, sitting in perfect stillness, facing east in the dark. It did not react to the headlamp, did not turn toward us or shield its face, or acknowledge the light in any way. It remained oriented toward the burn area, as if my beam was not information it needed to process. At some point during the next 40 minutes, while we held our south position waiting for Ortega, I swept the thermal scope across the north end of the ridge. I had been using the scope all night to check the burn line, and I had the baseline calibrated well. I knew what the warm rock signatures looked like, what the lingering combustion signatures looked like, what a person's heat signature looked like at 60 yards on a clear, cold night. A human body at mid-30s ambient produces a strong, unmistakable thermal bloom. The figure at the north position produced nothing. The granite it was sitting on retained some warmth from the day and showed a faint elevation on the scope. The figure itself was thermally flat, as cold in the reading as the unburned manzanita on the western slope, as cold as the rock itself. I had been looking at it for over an hour on the ambient and headlamp return, and I had not thought to run the thermal on it until then, and when I did, I sat with the reading for about 10 seconds before showing the scope to Holt. He looked at the display, he handed the scope back, he said nothing. There was nothing to say. Ortega reached the ridge at approximately 2:15 a.m., having driven the access road and walked the last quarter mile of trail on foot. She was moving quickly. I could hear her footsteps on the granite before I saw her headlamp cresting the trail, and she was carrying a large LED work light, the kind that runs off a lithium battery pack and delivers a wide, powerful flood. When she came over the crest, she swept it north immediately, without my having to direct her, which told me something about what she had been told on the phone down at the trailhead and what she had been expecting to find. The beam was significantly stronger than my headlamp and wide enough to illuminate the full width of the ridge at the north position without leaving anything in shadow at the margins. The figure was gone, not in the moment the light arrived. Ortega told us afterward that she had seen the silhouette clearly from approximately 40 yards as she came up the final section of trail, registered it, noted its position, oriented the work light toward it as she closed the distance. When she activated the light, the figure was already moving, not frozen in the beam, and then reacting, already withdrawing. The light had not yet reached the north position, and it was already at the eastern edge of the ridge, already at the burn line, already going over. By the time the full beam illuminated the watch position, the figure was on the burned east slope below the crest, descending. She watched it descend for 4 or 5 seconds. She described the movement as wrong for the terrain in a way that stayed with her long after the immediate incident. The burned east slope was steep. The surface was loose, decomposed granite under a layer of char, exactly the kind of ground that demands a careful descent in the dark, weight shifted back, steps placed deliberately. What she watched moving down that slope gave no indication that terrain required those adjustments. It moved at the same consistent pace across loose, burned ground that it would have moved across flat pavement, and then it was below the ridge line and gone into the black of the burn. And when I swept the thermal scope east at the slope immediately after, there was nothing on that surface registering as a heat signature. Whatever had descended, it left no thermal trace on the char. Ariel was located 11 minutes later, roughly 200 yards west of her watch position on the unburned side of the ridge, sitting against a juniper at the base of a rocky outcropping. She was physically unharmed. She was severely cold, her hands were shaking, her responses were slowed in the way of someone whose core temperature had been dropping for a while without the movement that would have maintained it. She was deeply disoriented about her location. Her last clear memory was returning from the soil sample point at 12:15 a.m. and settling back into her watch position. Nothing between that and Holt's flashlight in her face and the cold arriving in her awareness all at once. 2 hours, gone. No gap she could account for. No experience of time passing. Her radio battery was dead, which explained the non-response to our call. She had not heard us. A fully charged radio battery should run a full shift without issue. 3 hours of use should not have drained it. We got her down to the vehicles and off the ridge by 3:15 a.m. The Barnhart Access Road demands your full attention in the dark. It is a rough 2-track that climbs over 2,000 feet of vertical in a few miles and requires active concentration on every switchback and wash. Crossing, especially with headlights throwing hard shadows off the rock walls on either side. I was grateful for that demand on the drive down. All of us were. The practical requirement of navigating the road gave us something to be occupied with that was not the scope reading, not the burned slope, not the hour and 15 minutes in Ariel's log that held nothing. Ariel sat in the back seat with a space blanket and Holt's second coffee thermos, and she did not speak much on the way down. What she did say was practical and present tense. She asked where we were on the road. She asked if the burn was called contained. Normal questions. The kind a person asks when they are reorienting to a situation they have partially lost their thread on. She did not ask what had happened on the ridge. I did not tell her. That conversation has not fully happened since. The USFS incident report was filed by Ortega under Tonto National Forest case number TNF 81446. It listed the incident as a crew member becoming separated from her watch position due to a possible disorientation event, cause undetermined. The post-burn monitoring was completed by a subsequent day crew, and the burn was called fully contained. The north corner interface held without incident, the dozer lines never compromised, the manzanita never igniting. The fire documentation was clean. Holt and I debriefed with our contractor's safety officer 2 days later. He asked precise questions and wrote thorough notes, and at the end of the session he told us both that we had handled the incident correctly by not approaching the anomalous figure alone and by requesting supervisor response before any independent action. He used the phrase anomalous figure without qualifier or hesitation. We had not used that phrase in our own account. It came from somewhere else in the file, which meant the file had layers we had not seen, and the category already existed, and we were not the first crew to have provided content for it. I asked him if this type of incident had been reported on Tonto National Forest watches before. He said he was not in a position to discuss other incidents. That was its own answer. The thing I have thought about most in the time since is not the figure itself, not the thermal scope reading, or what Ortega saw on the burned slope. What I have thought about most is the timing and what it implies about the process. Ariel stepped off position at midnight for 15 minutes and radioed back at 12:15. At 1:30 a.m., Holt noticed the jacket was wrong. The transition, whatever it was, however it happened, occurred somewhere in that 75-minute window. Two possibilities. Either it happened while she was off position and the 12:15 radio check-in was non-aerial. It was close enough to her voice and her protocol to pass a brief check-in on a dark ridge at distance, which means it had been listening to her long enough prior to midnight to replicate not just her voice but her timing and her format. Or it happened after she returned and before Holt's observation at 1:30, which means it displaced her from a position she was actively occupying, and she has no memory of that displacement, and her body has no memory of it either. The first option is worse in what it implies about preparation. The second option is worse in what it implies about capability. Both options are bad. I have sat with both of them for over a year, and I have not found a version of either that I am comfortable with. Ariel has no memory of the 2 hours. She is physically well. She has not returned to field work in the Mazatzal unit. The record shows a disorientation event, cause undetermined. The thermal scope notes filed in my personal log and submitted with Holt's statement to the safety officer show a 0 signature read on the North Watch position at approximately 1:50 a.m. Those two sets of facts exist in the same event record, and they point in directions the official documentation cannot follow, and I understand why the official documentation cannot follow them. I understand it, and I accept it, and I am telling you anyway because the documentation is for the record, and this is for the people who do this work. There is a 1 hour and 15-minute gap in the Mazatzal Ridgeline Watch log from that October night. Whatever occupied that gap is still in the Mazatzal drainage. The Barnhart trailhead is open year-round. People park there every weekend. They do not know what has been watching the burn line from above. If you do post-burn overnight watches or any long-duration monitoring work in remote terrain with a small crew, no crew member goes off position alone after dark for any reason at any distance. Two-person movement every time. No exceptions made for brief durations or short distances. The 15 minutes that opened the window on that ridgeline was enough. Check in by radio every 15 minutes, not hourly, not every 30, 15 minutes. The standard interval is too long when something, that patient, is working inside a window. If someone at your watch position stops responding to radio and stops moving in cold conditions for more than 20 minutes, do not approach alone. Bring every light you have. Bring your other crew member. Approach together with the light ahead of you. And if what is at the position begins moving before your light arrives, if it detects the beam before the beam reaches it and is already withdrawing, do not follow. Move toward the road. Move toward the access point. Move toward the pavement and the vehicle and the distance from the tree line. The road has been the boundary in every account I have collected from people who do this work in the Southwest. Whatever it is, it does not follow onto pavement. It stops at the gravel to asphalt line, and it watches from there, and eventually it goes back to whatever it came from. The road is not much, but the road is what you have. Whatever was on that ridge in October knew how a watch position looks from the outside. It knew the jacket, the posture, the sightline orientation, the check-in interval, the protocol of a brief radio call at the correct time in the correct format. What it did not replicate correctly was how a person moves in the cold. It sat too still. It held the position with a uniformity that a human body in 34-degree air cannot produce and does not try to produce. The cold was not reaching it. That is always the tell. In every account I have heard, across every setting and every type of encounter, the thing that gives it away is the same thing. It does not move in the cold. It does not have to. And that one failure, that single gap in an otherwise thorough replication, is what costs it the deception every time. It is worth knowing. When you are on a watch in the cold and something at the far end of your line stops moving for longer than a body can hold still in that temperature, that is not discipline. That is a different kind of stillness entirely. Trust the movement, trust the absence of it, and keep your crew together.